I'm back. Abraham Lincoln was America's 16th president, and inarguably its most consequential. One could say that George Washington was the most consequential person in American history, but the actions that made him so, namely leading during the Revolutionary War, occurred prior to his presidency. Abraham Lincoln, during his presidency, took a splintered Union, one that was falling apart at the moment of his inauguration, and held it together by military force. It's something that no president has had to do prior, and no president has had to do since. The closest president to using force to hold together the Union was Andrew Jackson. He threatened the use of force against South Carolina during the nullification crisis of 1832. However, he never actually had to use troops against the South. In fact, it was Abraham Lincoln watching Andrew Jackson threaten to use force against a state in the Union that arguably gave him the idea, or rather affirmed in him this belief, that the Union itself was something worth fighting for. Welcome, explorers. It's good to be back. I'm William C. Fox. Support history on YouTube by going to patreon.com/William C. Fox. Today, we're going to be exploring the United States starting in the year 1863. And let me welcome you to this new series on how individuals came to power. Now, I want to make one thing clear here. I use the term power loosely. Obviously, we will cover notable figures, but by power, I don't only mean political office, also influence on culture and society. I will cover, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt in an episode, even though she never held office, aside from ambassador to the United Nations. I hope together we can meet and subvert expectations. We'll look at Napoleon, sure, that's what people expect. We might also examine someone like Rosa Luxemburg, whose political career ended floating in a Berlin canal. Today we're going to look at how Abraham Lincoln came to power and a little bit of his transition into power. We can see here at the Lincoln Memorial, there's symbolic bipolarism that was endemic in the United States during this time. It's a bipolarism that Abraham Lincoln shared. We're not talking about medical bipolarism. No, it's simply that most residents of the United States wanted to remain together, but disagreed deeply about the institution of slavery. You can see it on the two sides of the Lincoln Memorial. On the wall to the left of Lincoln, we have the 1863 Gettysburg Address, given by President Lincoln after the most consequential battle of the Civil War. On the other side, we have Lincoln's second inaugural address, a speech given at the cusp of victory. Now, on the Gettysburg side, what we see is a desire for unity, a desire for history to look back and to realize the sacrifice of the Civil War was made by all. The soldiers of the two sides are not distinguished north and south. There was a single America, struggling but destined to reunite. On the other side of the Lincoln Memorial, we have Lincoln's second inaugural address, given in 1865, and it is a lot longer than Gettysburg. But if you read this speech towards the final paragraph, you'll see this passage. "Every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword." Lincoln, like most Northerners, is torn between resentment for the other side, the people who endorsed this heinous institution of human enslavement, and his burning desire to keep the Union together. At the same time, Lincoln's life is this drawn-out struggle between his inner conscience about the abhorrence of slavery and his desire to see it ended, and yet his belief in the world of realpolitik, that the preservation of the country might be more important than ending the institution of slavery, as evil as he believed it might have been. This split thinking is something we'll examine together as we look at Lincoln's path to the Republican nomination in 1860 and the birth of that new Republican Party just a few years earlier. The first thing to know about Lincoln's rise to power is that it was a long and gradual one, with a drop and then a surge. He goes from a local politician to a congressman to a lower-profile trade lawyer to a failed Senate candidate, and then President of the United States. It can give you whiplash thinking about it. After being a postmaster and a surveyor in Illinois, he was elected to the state legislature as a Whig. If you remember, Whigs were a party formed in opposition to the Democratic politics of Andrew Jackson. He made his way advocating infrastructure projects and state banks, big issues of the time. By 1847, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, again as a Whig. True to Whig form, he opposed Andrew Jackson's protege, President James K. Polk, during the Mexican-American War. He saw the whole thing as aggressive and expansionary. By the way, it was quite expansionary. The U.S. victory over Mexico led to the acquisition of the lands that would make up Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado. And all of those places would have to decide whether to allow slavery or not. More on that later. After a single 2-year term in Congress, Lincoln left politics to practice law. This is the so-called country lawyer phase we see often referenced in Lincoln's biographies. His law practice revolved around interstate commerce and transport, and it is during this period in which he came to be known as Honest Abe. It was his legal reputation, not a childhood nickname, as many modern legends try to claim. In 1854, Lincoln re-entered politics due to his opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and therein, opposition to the expansion of slavery in new American territories. His party, the Whigs, were irrevocably split by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Lincoln reluctantly joined a fledgling new party, the Republican Party, in 1856. In 1858, Lincoln ran against Democrat Stephen Douglas for Illinois Senate. Their race featured a series of famous debates during which the two men most notably argued on how to best handle the issue of slavery. Lincoln lost that race, but had earned a small yet national reputation. In 1860, from a field of highly influential candidates, Lincoln sought and received the Republican nomination for president, then was elected as the 16th president of the United States, leading to events that made him perhaps the most influential historical figure of the century. Lincoln's career and rise reflect the American struggle over one thing: slavery. To understand Lincoln, one must understand his context. So let's talk about the America of the 1800s. Make no mistake, allow no revisionism. One of the lenses American history must be viewed through is the lens of race. The near century prior to Lincoln's election contains various moral compromises, including within the Constitution itself, that tacitly endorse the institution of slavery. At best, federal policy slowed the growth of the institution where it already existed and slowed its expansion into new territories. At best. The Constitution, ratified in 1789, contained 3 major references to slavery, though it never used the word. First, it codified the ongoing international slave trade until 1808. Article 1, Section 9, quote, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. No Congress could stop the international importation of humans into the U.S. for 20 years. The internal trading of slaves could continue in perpetuity, presumably. Second, there was a provision about fugitive slaves in Article 4, Section 3. If a person escaped indentured servitude, or more likely full bondage in a slave state, and went to a free state, they were to be returned. In fact, not just sent back. The language stipulates that they, quote, shall be delivered back to their owners from the free state to the slave state. Third and last, for purposes of counting during a census, apportioning seats in Congress, and directing taxes, the Constitution contained the 3/5 clause. Free people in a state counted as one person, and all other persons, slaves, counted as 3/5 a person. The moral compromises here are ostensibly to ensure that Southern states bought into and ratified the new Constitution. Lincoln, as we'll see, saw these moral compromises as necessity. And they don't end at the drafting of the Constitution. As the United States grew from the original 13 colonies, the issue of slavery reemerged. Would new states and territories have legal slavery, or would they be free? In early 1819, Missouri was on the verge of becoming the 24th state in the Union, and its most western. But anti-slavery advocates in the House of Representatives said Missouri shouldn't be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state. The House passed a bill which prohibited slavery in Missouri, but it didn't pass the Senate. Instead, Missouri was admitted as a slave state on the condition that the new state of Maine entered as a free state. Further, slavery would be forbidden in new states above the 3630 parallel. The idea here was not to disrupt the power structure in the federal government. Slave states and free states harbored resentment and suspicion of one another. Allowing a slave state to bring new members into the House and Senate might tip the scales in federal government towards slave states. The opposite could be true with more free states. The default option, then, was to maintain a relatively equal number. This uncomfortable equation was utilized many times. Renewed pressure came when new states were taken or formed. For example, after the Mexican-American War acquired vast swaths of Mexican territory for the United States. The Mexican-American War was also the first time the balance was upset in Abraham Lincoln's political career. When the United States acquired a large amount of new territory at the end of the war, a debate immediately broke out about whether slavery should be allowed in the new states. With so much new land, and so many potential new states on the table, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was called into question 30 years later. And so, again, there was a moral compromise in 1850 called, you guessed it, the Compromise of 1850. It brought in Texas as a slave state, California as a free state, and let Utah and New Mexico decide on their own. Unlike the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850 stayed contentious. Politicians began to define themselves by whether or not they supported the compromise. The Whig Party, Abraham Lincoln's party, began to divide over the issue. 4 years later, 1854, settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories began to agitate for integration into the Union. Naturally, the question arose whether slavery be expanded into the new territories. And once again, the debate about slavery ignited, this time irreversibly. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, as you might expect. The passage of the act was swift and surprising. News of it went off like a grenade. It upset people like Lincoln because it set in motion a potential expansion of slavery outside its traditional boundaries. Remember, the key of the Missouri Compromise was that slavery not be expanded above the 3630 parallel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act left the decision of whether to have slavery to white men in Kansas and Nebraska, people in territories above that line. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was, in effect, a repeal of the 1820 Missouri Compromise. As Lincoln and others saw it, this meant pro-slavery elements could flood the new states, creating two new slave states outside the decades-old boundaries, expanding an immoral institution while breaking the balance of power in Washington forever. The righteous anger was fueled by anti-slavery sentiment, which had been boiling hot in the North for years. To top it all off, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was championed by a Democratic politician from Illinois, Abe Lincoln's home state, Senator Stephen Douglas. Douglas deemed this decision-making process, the process by which Kansas and Nebraska would choose whether to have slavery or not, as popular sovereignty, a formulation that would become infamous. Lincoln's opposition to the act and his direct opposition to Senator Stephen Douglas would pave his way to power. Lincoln was first and foremost opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. If Douglas's intention was to prevent political upheaval with his so-called compromise, he had clearly failed. The nation was deeply embroiled in the debate over slavery in a way unseen since before the Missouri Compromise was first instituted. The American Union had been preserved through uncomfortable compromises through the decades. Kansas-Nebraska had shattered that state of affairs. Lincoln's passion against Kansas-Nebraska manifested in movement, literal movement. He went about shadowing Senator Douglas around the state of Illinois, sometimes speaking hours after Douglas did in the exact same venue. Once, when Douglas finished a speech, Lincoln rose to inform the crowd he would make a rebuttal in the same spot the next day. His message: Douglas was wrong. Kansas-Nebraska was wrong. In one of his notable speeches against Kansas, Nebraska, and Peoria, he unveiled a reason why the idea of popular sovereignty was flawed. If the system of the new territories were to be based on self-governance, then having a vote to allow slavery would necessitate that one comes to the conclusion that African Americans were not men. Quote, "But if the Negro is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? In other words, does all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence not apply? Lincoln's position on Kansas, Nebraska was clear. His opposition to the expansion of slavery was clear. But Lincoln's position on slavery itself was not as clear-cut as that quote might lead you to believe. In fact, Lincoln at first resisted leaving the Whig Party for the newly founded Republican Party for the exact reason that they appeared to be a radical party of opposition to slavery, of full abolition, perhaps even equality between the races. Lincoln's position went roughly like this. The founders had an arrangement that slavery would exist in the Union, but not expand to new states, and would be gradually eliminated. Slavery was to be tolerated where it already existed, but to not expand. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had violated the arrangement. Further, slavery was immoral and an affront to the idea of free labor. To let each state and territory simply vote whether to have slavery or not, as Douglas advocated, was to invite its creep, its spread across the nation. And as the founders had intended for the federal government to have control over the expansion or non-expansion of slavery into new territories, this was unacceptable. The argument contains difficulty. Slavery is immoral, yet it must be tolerated and protected where it already exists. Slavery should be gradually abolished, but then what? Lincoln claimed to be opposed to equality, so should freedmen be sent across the Atlantic to Liberia, as he once suggested? Lincoln was nonetheless inspiring crowds, like in his Cooper Union address in New York just 2 months before the Republican National Convention. There, he unveiled several famous lines and moral arguments, including "right makes might," a reversal of Plato's character Thrasymachus, who claimed might makes right. And ultimately, Lincoln was threading a political needle. As he said in one of his 1859 speeches, "Whoever would prevent slavery becoming national and perpetual yields all when he yields to a policy which deals with it as being right or as a matter of indifference." Again, he's mixing moral clarity with a policy of non-expansion, not full abolition. If you find it a bit hard to follow, you wouldn't be alone. By creating this opaque policy with quasi-clarity, Lincoln allowed audiences to hear what they needed, perhaps better said, what they wanted to hear. As we'll see in a bit, by allowing people to imprint their own thoughts onto himself, Lincoln better positioned himself to secure delegates at the convention and be less easy to paint by opposition in the general election. He was a brilliant political operator. But we've gotten ahead of ourselves. First, Lincoln would need to rise as a national figure, not merely stay a fixture of Illinois politics, following Senator Douglas around and agitating him on the stump. So, Lincoln decided to run against Douglas for Senate. Using goodwill developed over decades of Whig politics, Lincoln maneuvered himself into becoming the Illinois Republican Senate candidate in 1858, running against Stephen Douglas, the cause of all this Kansas-Nebraska drama. It was an epic showdown. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas, held all over Illinois, would receive national attention, for they addressed the hottest issue of the day: slavery. One is often defined by their enemies. Lincoln had been following Douglas around for years at this point, debating with his shadow wherever he went. Now that Lincoln was the opposing nominee for Senate, the two men agreed to appear together and debate in front of crowds, something unusual at the time. As opponents, they used each other to define themselves. The arguments were long, detailed, and often intermixed with the live reaction of the crowd, which at times outnumbered the population of the town in which the debate was being held. Douglas and Lincoln pushed each other on the issue of slavery, the Dred Scott decision, the founders' views, and the wider issue of racial equality. On that issue, Lincoln made his position clear. Quote, "I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position." On another day, quote, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters of Negroes, or jurors, or qualifying them to hold office, or having them to marry with white people. I will say, in addition, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I suppose will forever forbid the two races living together upon terms of social and political equality." The 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates raised Lincoln's profile to the national stage. It wasn't only the audience in attendance that knew the arguments, but the wider public that read transcripts in newspapers. Reporters were sent from papers like the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Times to shorthand transcribe the debates. This was the first time allies of Lincoln began to murmur about a presidential run, and in the following year, 1859, he was sent around to support candidates in Ohio and Indiana as a regional celebrity. By the way, the result of the Senate election between Lincoln and Douglas was anticlimactic. After voters went to the polls, the Illinois state legislature voted to return Douglas to the Senate, 56 for Douglas, 46 for Lincoln. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution with direct election of senators wasn't a thing yet. No matter. Lincoln had defined himself. He was now as relevant a figure as Douglas, and these two men would meet again very soon. Lincoln and his allies set their sights on the Republican nomination of 1860. There were no primaries or caucuses, as there are today. Delegates had to be won from the many states on the convention floor. The Republican National Convention of 1860 was held in Chicago, a boost to Lincoln as a hometown favorite. But Lincoln, despite his increasing profile, was still far less notable than Henry Seward, Whig senator and former New York governor. Even opposition papers declared it a, quote, settled fact that Seward would be the nominee. Though Seward was the clear favorite to win the nomination, he did have some factors working against him. First, he seemed to some to have too clear a stance on slavery. That is, he opposed it fervently throughout his career. To understand this, we have to ignore our modern feelings about slavery and simply see it through a crass political lens. Someone with a clear position on the most divisive issue of the day, the issue tearing the nation apart, meant alienating potential convention voters on the way to the nomination, and, assuming one makes it through, voters in the general election thereafter. Rather than work out differences with enemies, Seward spent months before the Republican National Convention on a diplomatic tour of Europe, courting the heads of state he would soon be dealing with as president. Another disadvantage for Seward was his convention strategist, Thurlow Weed, a master lever in New York's political machine. It made for a bad look for a candidate in a new political party trying to show its non-corrupt bona fides. Seward had also made an enemy of the Republican newspaper editor Horace Greeley after a falling out in 1854. The influential writer reported and edited for the New York Tribune, at first with a bias for Bates, then Lincoln, but definitely not Seward. Seward was nonetheless the clear favorite, likely to carry the nomination on the first ballot at the convention. And if not him, there were still plenty of options before Abraham Lincoln. For example, Salmon P. Chase. Chase was also a well-known figure, a former senator and a governor of Ohio. And if you hadn't noticed before, there were like a billion presidents from Ohio at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. Not only was Chase the governor of the state, he was the first Republican governor of any state, a whirlwind and virulent opponent of slavery. Or maybe the Republican convention would choose Edward Bates of Missouri, still more notable than Lincoln. Bates had served in the U.S. House and the Missouri State House and Senate. The elderly former congressman was still nationally relevant and served a potential strategic purpose for Republicans. He appealed in so-called border states between North and South. His advocacy of free labor was less offensive to Southerners than the abolitionism of Seward or Chase. His nomination and election, thought some, may prevent a split in the Union. The lineup of talent going into the convention in Chicago made Lincoln a dark horse candidate. Understanding the anatomy of this new party and the minutiae of the convention itself would be critical. The Republican Party was a wide combination of anti-Kansas, Nebraska politicians, abolitionists, anti-slavery Democrats, nativists, former Whigs, free soil, free labor types. As T. Harry Williams put it, no polyglot army of an ancient emperor ever exhibited more variety than the Republican Party in 1860. Lincoln was seen as the moderate in this diverse party. Though his views on slavery were similar to Seward, Lincoln intentionally wanted to not appear as a radical abolitionist, but rather thread the needle and appeal to as broad a coalition in his party as possible. And one advantage of being a more obscure figure, when he did express strong anti-slavery sentiment, it often went unnoticed, thereby preventing opposition and distaste from building, as happened with Seward. Lincoln simply had fewer enemies. As Lincoln's general views were lesser known than the national figure of Seward, delegates were able to imprint their own thoughts onto Lincoln. Additionally, Republicans could strategize that Lincoln would be harder to negatively portray by the Democrats. Seward's long opposition to slavery was seen as a means to rally all Democrats against him, Northern and Southern. The most likely outcome of the convention was that Seward, the heavy favorite, would win a majority on the first ballot. Lincoln's convention team knew they would need to prevent that from happening, and then, astutely, to make Abraham Lincoln the second choice of the delegates. Offend no one, be everyone's second favorite, prevent Seward from getting a majority on the first ballot. That was the tactic. Lincoln's men, knowing they were the distant underdogs, also used their home turf advantage in Chicago to push through some shenanigans. First, they printed extra tickets for their local supporters, leaving Seward folks outside and creating a pro-Lincoln atmosphere inside. Second, they arranged for critical delegations to be separated, making it difficult for Seward's men to organize wavering supporters. Finally, Lincoln's convention strategist David Davis made promises on the convention floor for state organizers that could help flip their delegation, namely jobs in a Lincoln administration. Though Lincoln had expressly forbidden such promises, they were made. The night before balloting began, a general sense of Seward's inevitability swept through the convention attendees. For Seward's supporters, the lack of consolidation behind an alternative was cause for a celebration. For Seward opponents, these hours were seen as the final shot at solidifying against him. Lincoln's convention team worked hard to move support to Lincoln that night, wooing the soft Indiana delegation and convincing New Jersey and Pennsylvania delegates to move Lincoln on the second ballot. Things were shifting behind the scenes. When the first ballot arrived the next morning, it was clear Seward's opponents outnumbered his supporters. He polled 173 delegates, Lincoln 102, Chase and Bates around 50 each. Though he did have a plurality of support, Seward had not secured the nomination outright, seeding doubt and elongating the process. The other contenders, Chase and Bates, were distant finishers and had lost some of their safe delegates to Lincoln unexpectedly. Bates had also banked on the idea of being everyone's second choice, but had fallen short in that category to Lincoln. Chase failed to even find uniform support in his home state of Ohio. He had done the opposite of Lincoln, so assured of victory and worthiness that he didn't properly strategize. On the second ballot, the first flip to Lincoln was Delaware, then Pennsylvania. Lincoln was within striking distance of Seward, and Chase and Bates were out. On the third ballot, a handful of additional delegates went to Lincoln before the big drop. Ohio, originally split between Chase and Lincoln, was now entirely backing Lincoln. He had a majority. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican nominee for president. The dark horse of the convention had solidified opposition to Seward and secured the victory. With the Republican nomination, Lincoln now needed to win the general election. The greatest advantage Lincoln had was that the Democratic Party was split. Southern Democrats advocated no restrictions on slavery or its expansion, rejecting the popular sovereignty argument from their own Stephen Douglas. At the Democratic Convention, Southern states tried to force an unrestrained pro-slavery platform through. They proposed that not only would slavery be allowed in all states and territories, but that the federal government should actively ensure its protection. And upon the failure of this radical platform to pass with the majority of delegates from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas left the convention, leaving it unable to conduct business without a quorum. The Northern Democrats were forced to reconvene in June, and they nominated Lincoln's old rival Stephen Douglas. But the party split was apparent. The Southern Democrats held their own separate convention and nominated John Breckinridge, thus confirming the Northern Democrats and the Southern would separate their votes, bolstering a Republican's ability to win the states needed for an electoral college majority. Someone in the comment section is already complaining that I haven't mentioned Lincoln's old party, the Whigs. Southern Whigs held a convention in Baltimore, rebranded as the Constitutional Union Party, and nominated John Bell, with a platform endorsing constitutionalism and the preservation of the Union. They basically wanted to dodge the slavery issue and keep the country together. It's a message that would win them 4 states in the end. So the general election would be a 4-way matchup. The Republicans, led by Lincoln, Northern Democrats with Stephen Douglas, Southern Democrats with John Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Union Party with John Bell. It was expected that Breckinridge and Bell would fight for the South, while Lincoln and Douglas would get a head-to-head rematch throughout the North. Lincoln needed an outright majority of electoral votes to prevent the election from going to the House of Representatives. This meant he needed to carry the entirety of the North, along with California and Oregon. Lincoln quickly consolidated his former rivals, either recruiting them to write praise or actually venture out onto the campaign trail on his behalf. The most surprising turnaround was Henry Seward, who ended up making numerous fiery speeches on Lincoln's behalf. Lincoln himself remained quiet during the general election, as was considered dignified and presidential in this time period. His rival, Stephen Douglas, did the exact opposite, campaigning heavily all over the country, particularly border states, attempting to will his way into the White House. It wouldn't be enough. Not all states voted on the same day in 1860. Positive results for Lincoln from Indiana and Pennsylvania arrived in October before National Election Day, November 6th. Thurlow Weed, originally organizing for Seward to win the Republican nomination, now ensured New York City, and therefore the state of New York, went to Lincoln. It was over. Voter turnout was a record high, over 80%. Lincoln comfortably won the Electoral College majority, losing only a few scattered votes to Stephen Douglas, who only managed to carry Missouri. The South went to Breckinridge, but it wasn't enough. Winning the presidency in the 19th century didn't mean a rapid transition. With the election officially decided early November, Lincoln would now have to wait 4 months for his March inauguration. His final weeks away from power would come to define his years in power. One can't examine Lincoln's rise to power without looking at the transition. While the split in the Democratic Party had cleared Lincoln's path to the presidency, his victory also initiated the division of the United States into North and South. Days after the election, South Carolina, the first state to secede, was already planning that departure, with Lincoln's election as the pretext. And with 4 months before assuming office, Lincoln would have to wait a long time before taking action. State secession unfolded like a domino effect. 6 of what would become the 11 Confederate states seceded before Lincoln's inauguration. On December 20th, 1860, a South Carolina state convention declared secession. Mississippi was next on January 9th, 1861, then Florida on January 10th, followed by Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas on February 1st. There was still a month before Inauguration Day. By the way, in case anyone need reminding why these states seceded, here are their own words from their own secession statements. Georgia, first line, quote, "We have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states, with reference to the subject of African slavery. Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. South Carolina, those non-slaveholding states have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. Texas, in all the non-slaveholding states, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery." Just so we're clear, while the South broke off from the rest of the U.S., Lincoln was assembling a cabinet. In a move which has earned attention, most notably endorsed Kearns Goodwin's team of rivals, read even by Barack Obama, Lincoln assembled just that, a team of his former rivals. The day after securing election victory, he noted that he'd like to involve Seward, Chase, and Bates in his new administration, along with all relevant wings of the new Republican Party. He offered Seward the position of Secretary of State, to Salmon Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, to Edward Bates went Attorney General. Overall, his cabinet, including himself, was an even split between former Whigs and former Democrats, a reflection of his deep desire for reconciliation that would last throughout the war. Lincoln was, at his core, a coalition builder. He did so pulling together factions at the Republican National Convention, assembling his cabinet, and holding his party together prior to inauguration, and ultimately in victory over the South in the Civil War. When it was clear in 1865 that the North would be victorious, Lincoln entered negotiations with the South, referring to the Union as our one common country. Had he survived John Wilkes Booth's bullet, the reparation of the nation after the war would have undoubtedly gone differently. But for now, at his inauguration in 1861, as he entered power, Lincoln was determined to use it. Quote, "No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary." The Battle of Fort Sumter and the American Civil War would begin in 1 month. And those are the circumstances by which Abraham Lincoln came to power. Click around, watch other videos of mine. If you have a suggestion for another figure for us to tackle together, whether they held political office or not, tweet me at William C. Fox. Good to be back. Later, y'all.